She was sure he'd beg. She was sure he'd explain. She was sure he'd panic when she pulled away. She was sure her distance would make him chase harder. Because that's what always happened. Every time she went cold, he stepped closer. Every time she ignored him, he tried harder. Every time she tested him, he proved himself again. So when she pulled back this time, she expected the same outcome. But something went wrong. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't try to fix the mood. He didn't explain himself. He just stopped. Not dramatically. Not angrily. Not to make a point. He stopped emotionally. And that's the moment her confidence cracked. Because women prepare for arguments. They prepare for breakups. They even prepare for men begging. But they are never prepared for a man who walks away without asking for permission. A man who doesn't need closure. A man who doesn't need answers. A man who doesn't need her reaction anymore. And when she realized, he wasn't playing a game. He wasn't trying to scare her. He wasn't waiting for her response. That's when panic set in. Not because she suddenly loved him, but because the one thing she always controlled was no longer in her hands. And once a man reaches that point, there is no begging left to expect. After the silence sets in, something strange happens. Not on the surface. Not immediately, but deep inside her. Because she was never prepared for this version of you. She was prepared for arguments. Prepared for emotional conversations. Prepared for long explanations, apologies, late-night messages, and second chances. What she was never prepared for was a man who simply stopped reaching. A man who didn't ask why anymore. Didn't demand answers. Didn't try to fix what she broke. You didn't storm out. You didn't threaten to leave. You didn't even announce your exit. You just withdrew. And that's what confused her. Because in her mind, your role was clear. You were supposed to stay. You were supposed to chase. You were supposed to react. For a long time, you did. You gave explanations when she went cold. You tried to understand when she became distant. You adjusted when she pulled back. You lowered your expectations just to keep the peace. Every time she withdrew a little, you leaned in more. You told yourself love required patience. That understanding meant tolerance. That effort would eventually be appreciated. But what you didn't realize back then was that every time you chased clarity, she felt more secure doing less. She got comfortable in your consistency. Comfortable knowing you'd always be there to absorb the confusion. Comfortable knowing silence from her would create noise in you. Comfortable knowing she could pull away emotionally, and you'd bridge the gap. And slowly, without meaning to, the dynamic shifted. You weren't equals anymore. You were investing. She was receiving. You were explaining. She was observing. You were emotionally present. She was emotionally relaxed. That imbalance didn't happen overnight. It happened quietly. So quietly that you didn't even notice when self-respect started slipping out of the room. Until one day, something inside you stopped. Not dramatically. Not angrily. It was exhaustion. The kind that doesn't scream. The kind that just goes numb. You realized you were carrying the emotional weight of two people. That every conversation depended on your effort. That every moment of closeness required you to initiate. And something clicked. You understood that love shouldn't feel like a negotiation. That connection shouldn't feel like a test. That being chosen shouldn't feel conditional. That's when you stopped explaining. Not as a tactic. Not to teach her a lesson. But because you finally ran out of energy to keep proving your value to someone who was already benefiting from it. And here's what most people don't understand about that moment. When a man stops explaining, he's not trying to regain control. He's letting go of it. That's the moment she didn't see coming. At first, she thought it was temporary. She assumed you were just quiet, maybe busy, maybe tired. She waited for the familiar pattern, for you to come back asking questions, for you to reopen the conversation, for you to seek reassurance. But you didn't. And that's when the discomfort began. Because your silence wasn't loud. It was empty. There was no tension to react to. No anger to calm down. No insecurity to reassure. Just absence. And absence does something powerful to someone who was used to your presence. It removes predictability. She started noticing small things. You didn't respond the same way anymore. You didn't rush to reply. You didn't fill the gaps when conversation slowed. Your tone stayed calm, neutral, detached, not cold, just unavailable. And that terrified her more than anger ever could. Because anger means there's still emotional access. Detachment means the door is closing. She tested it. A subtle message. A change in tone. A delayed reply meant to trigger anxiety. Normally, that would have worked. Normally, you'd feel the shift immediately. You'd wonder what changed. You'd replay conversations in your head. You'd reach out to restore connection. But this time, nothing happened. You didn't chase the silence. You didn't ask for clarity. You didn't try to decode her behavior. You stayed grounded. And that's when she felt something unfamiliar. Loss of control. Because for the first time, your emotions were no longer accessible to her. She couldn't pull you closer by pulling away. She couldn't regulate her mood through your reactions. She couldn't feel secure by knowing you'd always respond. You were still there, but emotionally out of reach. And here's the part no one warns her about. When a man stops chasing, the power doesn't shift dramatically. It evaporates. There's nothing to grab onto, nothing to manipulate, nothing to lean against, just space. And space forces reflection. She started replaying moments she once ignored. Your patience, your consistency, the way you always showed up emotionally even when she didn't. Things she once took for granted now felt fragile. Because suddenly, there was a version of reality where you weren't emotionally available anymore. And she didn't create that version intentionally. She assumed you'd always stay. That assumption is what broke the illusion. Because when a man finally stops chasing, he doesn't become cruel. He becomes clear. He stops negotiating his worth, stops shrinking his needs, stops over-explaining feelings to someone who benefits from misunderstanding them. And that clarity is dangerous to anyone who relied on your emotional labor without giving it back. She didn't lose you in a single moment. She lost you the moment you realized. You didn't need to convince someone to value you. And deep down, she could feel it happening. The shift was subtle but irreversible. Your presence no longer centered around her. Your attention no longer waited for her cues. Your energy stopped orbiting her moods. You were no longer asking to be chosen. You had already chosen yourself. And that's when the realization began to form in her mind. But she still wasn't ready for what came next. He didn't change overnight. That's the part she never understood. He didn't wake up one day and decide to stop caring. He slowly learned what it feels like to give everything and receive nothing that feels real in return. For a long time, he stayed quiet about it. He convinced himself it was temporary, that she was just stressed, that love sometimes looks uneven. But deep down, something was eroding. Every time she dismissed his feelings, every time she expected him to understand but never tried to understand him, every time she pulled away emotionally and assumed he'd chase harder. She thought his patience meant weakness. She thought his consistency meant safety. She thought his silence meant he'd always be there. What she never realized was that he was paying attention. And slowly, something inside him shifted. He stopped explaining himself. Not because he didn't care, but because he realized explaining never changed anything. He stopped reacting to mixed signals. He stopped trying to fix moods he didn't create. He stopped carrying emotional weight that was never shared. From the outside, it looked like nothing happened. But inside him, clarity was forming. And clarity is dangerous to someone who depends on control. She felt it before she understood it. Her words didn't land the same. Her silence didn't trigger panic anymore. Her distance no longer pulled him closer. And that's when unease crept in. Because for the first time, she couldn't read him. He was still there. But he wasn't available, still respectful, still calm, still present, but no longer emotionally accessible in the way she relied on. That's when she tried to test him. A colder tone, a delayed reply, a subtle jab, a moment of withdrawal meant to pull him back into old patterns. And when he didn't react, confusion turned into discomfort. Because when a man stops reacting, He's no longer predictable. She laughed it off at first, told herself she was imagining things, told herself he'd be back to normal soon. But late at night, when there was no distraction, no validación, no attention waiting, the anxiety began. She checked her phone more often, reread old conversations, looked for signs that he still needed her. And what she found scared her. He wasn't chasing clarity. He wasn't seeking reassurance. He wasn't asking for access to her emotions. He was grounded, focused, calm, centered in a way he'd never been before. And that's when she realized something uncomfortable. She wasn't losing him because another woman replaced her. She was losing him because he replaced the version of himself that tolerated less. That realization hits differently, because there's no one to compete with, no one to blame, no villain, just consequences. She tried to reconnect emotionally, soft messages, nostalgic memories, hints of vulnerability she never offered when he needed it. But it didn't work the same anymore, because he wasn't cold, he wasn't cruel, he wasn't angry, he was done negotiating his worth. And that's when panic set in. Not loud panic. Not dramatic panic. The quiet kind. The kind that whispers, "Wait, what if I miscalculated?" The kind that realizes control is gone. Because here's the truth most people avoid. What she feels in that moment isn't sudden love. It's the loss of access. Access to his effort, his emotional availability, his reassurance, his presence. And when access disappears, the illusion collapses. She remembers the man he used to be, the patience, the loyalty, the way he stayed when leaving would have been easier. And for the first time, she understands what she lost. But understanding doesn't reverse time. Because he didn't leave dramatically. He didn't announce his departure. He didn't beg to be seen. He simply stopped pouring into a place that kept him empty. And that kind of departure doesn't invite negotiation. It invites reflection. That's why she feels regret in silence. Because there's nothing to argue with, nothing to fix, nothing to fight, only absence. And absence hits harder than rejection ever could. He didn't walk away to punish her. He walked away to preserve himself. And that's the part she never expected. She thought if he ever pulled back, it would be emotional, messy, desperate. But instead, it was calm, controlled, final. And when a man reaches that point, there's no speech that brings him back. Because he's no longer asking to be chosen. He chose himself. That's the moment she realizes something irreversible happened. The man who once stayed through confusion, now walks forward with clarity. Not because he hates her, but because he respects himself. And that realization stays with her, long after the messages stop, long after the silence settles. Long after she understands she misread patience for permanence. So if you're listening to this, understand something clearly. You didn't lose value when you stopped chasing. You revealed it. You weren't asking for too much. You were offering more than most people ever will. And walking away wasn't weakness. It was self-respect. Because the man who stops begging for emotional access is the man who finally becomes untouchable. And that's the version of you she never thought she'd meet. But she did. Too late. If this video put words to something you felt but never explained, you're not alone. And if you're ready to stop chasing validation and start walking in clarity, subscribe. Because this channel isn't about bitterness. It's about awakening. And the next video might be the one that changes how you see everything.